Okay, great. So let's start. Good evening, everyone. My name is Ophir דיין. I'm the president of Students Supporting Israel at Columbia University. I'm Israeli. I grew up in Israel and lived there until I was 23 when I moved to the United States to pursue my undergraduate degree at Columbia University. And I have been the president of Students Supporting Israel at Columbia. I think this is my second year, my fourth semester. And today we're going to cover a little bit of what the hell is going on with the Israeli government. I know Sophia told me not to say hell. I'm sorry. I know it's super confusing. It involves coalitions, negotiations, the Supreme Court every now and then. And to people who lived here in the United States, it might be very confusing. Although, let me assure you that for me, the American system is no less confusing than the Israeli system is to you. The fact that someone can win the majority of the vote and still not be president is very confusing to me. So now we're going to cover a little of what's going on in the Israeli elections and the negotiations to assemble the current coalition. Before we start, something that is very important to me to make a disclaimer: SSI is not a partisan movement. It's not a political movement. We have activists from the left and from the right of the political spectrum, both in Israeli politics and in American politics. Most of this presentation is just facts, but if you think that you hear a hint of political opinions, these are my own and not representing SSI or SSI Columbia. Let's start. Let's talk a bit about the Israeli political system. So the Israeli political system, I'm going to brief through it because I assume that most of you are familiar with it, but if not, please ask questions. The Israeli system is a system of proportional representation, which means that people go to their ballot boxes, they vote for a party, not a candidate. They vote for a list of candidates representing a party. And in the end of the day, what comes out of it is a body, a parliament, that consists of many parties, each representing a certain sect or a certain ideology in the Israeli context. There are multiple parties, as I said, each of them representing really different people, from the Arab Joint List representing, which is in itself a group of parties who came together representing different factions, mostly of Arab Israelis, and all the way to Yamina, which represents mostly right-wing, but also sectarial parties like Shas, who represents ultra-Orthodox Mizrahi or Sephardi Jews, or UTJ, United Torah Judaism, who represents Ashkenazi ultra-Orthodox. All parties who pass the threshold, which is currently at 3.25% of the vote, are represented in direct proportion to the share of the vote that they got. If a party is below that threshold, it is not represented in the parliament, the Knesset. The implications of this system is that the prime minister would almost always be the head of one of the big parties, currently either Likud or Blue and White. In the past was either Likud or Labor. No one party can govern alone. Never in the history of Israel has one party got enough votes to not need a coalition. The number of seats they need to get is 61 out of 120, which is more than 50%, and no party received that in the past. So what they have to do is assemble a coalition, which means they have to go into negotiations with different parties in order to assemble a government. The coalition is all the members of Knesset, more than 61, who belong to the coalition, and out of these people there is the government, who are the senior members of the coalition who get ministerial portfolios. Smaller parties have a lot of negotiating power because the bigger parties need them. They cannot assemble the coalition without them. Let's put aside for a second what we'll be speaking about mostly in this presentation, which is national unity government, where two big parties are coming together. But usually the big party, who is the main member of the coalition, will need smaller parties. Therefore, they have negotiating power. This negotiating power means that they can demand to get certain portfolios in the government, to get certain ministries. It means also they can ask for certain budgets or certain other benefits or positions. Please mute yourself. What you see here in the picture is actually a meeting of what came to be known as the bloc. The right-wing bloc. In the last year, with its multiple election cycles, this bloc formed. It's a group of all the right-wing and ultra-Orthodox parties who decided to negotiate together as one bloc, because even together they did not have 61 seats. So they decided that in the case they will need to team up with other parties in order to form a government, they will go together. Not so much the case now. It kind of disintegrated, but we will touch on it briefly. So after the last elections, and by last I mean the last, not the last election cycle, really the last election, these were the results. The Likud is the biggest party with 36 seats. Just to reiterate, there is 120 seats. The biggest party only got 36. That's not a lot. In terms of Israeli politics, it's a lot. If you compare it to the United States, obviously it's not. The second largest is Blue and White, the party led by Benny Gantz. Then the Arab Joint List, who got 15 seats. Shas, who, as I said, is representing Sephardi ultra-Orthodox, got 9. Israel Beitenu, more commonly known as Lieberman and his gang, got 7. UTJ, United Toward Judaism, representing Ashkenazi ultra-Orthodox, got 7. Labor Gesher Meretz, which is 3 parties who came together for the elections. The Labor, as I'm sure you're mostly aware because it's all around the world, Gesher is a party led by Orly Levy, formerly with Lieberman, now not. And Meretz is a left-wing party in Israel, more left than Labor. And Yamina, which is a right-wing party in Israel, got 6 seats. However, after the elections, troubles in paradise, okay? Something really interesting happened, and all these parties started disintegrating. Blue and White split up to 2 parties, Yesh Atid, who has 16 seats and is led by Yair Lapid. Formerly, it ran alone. In the election cycles that preceded this year, they ran alone. Now they ran as a part of Blue and White with Benny Gantz. But after the elections, they split up. Yesh Atid and Telem went together with 16 seats. Blue and White, who kept the name and kept the leader, Benny Gantz, was left with 15 seats. Derech Eretz, that was a part of Blue and White, or also split outside of Blue and White and has 2 seats. Labor, Meretz, and Gesher realized that this weird combo does not work, and Labor was left with 3 members of Knesset, which is like historical proportions. Labor led Israel for more than 30 years. It was the largest party, the party who got closest to being able to form a coalition on its own, was left with only 3 seats. Meretz left with 3 seats, and Gesher left only with Orly Levy, the nice lady that you see here in the picture. The guy in the center is Amir Peretz, the head of the Labor Party, and the guy on the left is Horowitz, the head of Meretz. Now, the 2 key figures in our story, Benjamin Netanyahu, the current Prime Minister of Israel, and Benny Gantz, both of them Binyamin, and they share a long history. Gantz was chief of staff of the Israel Defense Forces under Benjamin Netanyahu. Netanyahu actually appointed Gantz to be the chief of staff, and throughout the last year, their relationship went sour. Gantz said Bibi is corrupt and not worthy of being prime minister, and Bibi said that Gantz doesn't have the leadership capabilities and that he cracks under pressure. These are only the more subtle allegations that they made towards each other. I'm sure that if you're interested, you can find nastier stuff that they said, and if you can't and you're interested in some cheap gossip, you have my contact info in the end of this presentation. I can send you a few juicy sayings, among them Bibi claiming that guns will go with people who support terrorism, and etc., etc. And then one day, after month and month of no government, more than a year that Israel does not have a functioning government, something happened. And I'm not speaking about the agreement. What happened is coronavirus, COVID-19. This pandemic caught the entire world unprepared, and some even say that this is the biggest reason that Israel now is heading towards a government. Both Netanyahu and Gantz, who until then were busy fighting each other and trying to assemble a coalition that does not include the other, understood that this cannot go on. Israel cannot continue managing this pandemic without a government. A government is not simply, having people in certain positions. It means that with a lack of government, people are not being appointed, budgets are not being approved by the Knesset, the yearly budgets, and things are very, very hard to handle when there is no functioning government. So they understood they need to do something about it. And they, after a very long few months, more than a year of no government and a few hectic weeks of rumors, they reached an agreement, they signed it. And the agreement between them originally said that no legislation unrelated to the pandemic is going to be made in the first few months of the government, which is also referred to as the emergency period. The government is formed for 36 months. Which means it's 3 years instead of the usual 4 years, and that the government consists of not just, as usual, a bunch of parties coming together to form a government. It consists of 2 blocks, each having the same power. Okay, so if one block has X ministers, the other block would have the same amount of ministers. If one block has a certain amount of heads of committees in the Knesset, the other one would have the same power. And that's very significant because until then, smaller parties could negotiate with a bigger party in the coalition to gain some portfolios. And now it creates a situation in which, for example, the Likud bloc has to give some of its ministerial portfolios to other parties like UTJ and Shas, who are considered a part of the bloc. And the blue and white bloc would have to give some of the ministerial posts that they're getting in the agreement to, for example, Labor, who are a part of the blue and white bloc in the government. And for all purposes, they work as 2 blocks, not separate parties in a coalition. When it comes to the prime minister, under the agreement, Benjamin Netanyahu is going to serve for the first 18 months, and then Gantz is going to serve for another 18 months. So this is called a rotation. They rotate halfway through the tenure of the government. Now there is certain negotiations to extend. We said earlier that they agreed that the government is going to be established for 3 years. Now they're speaking about extending it to 4, and then each prime minister could serve for 2 full years. Another thing that they wrote in the agreement, that live-in, working, and security arrangements are equal between the prime minister and what they call there's the prime minister, and then there's the replacement prime minister, the one who will be prime minister right before, right after. So right now, Gantz would be, it's not deputy, it's like replacement prime minister. And then like in the agreement, they phrase it as spare prime minister, which I think is very disrespectful, but let's use that term, spare prime minister, and then when Gantz assumes office as prime minister, Netanyahu is going to be giving that title. So under the agreement, they decided that living, working, and security arrangements are equal. This is very significant for many Israelis because right now there is one residence for the prime minister, and under this agreement, there will have to be another residence for the spare prime minister, another office for the spare prime minister. Obviously, the spare prime minister would still get security, but it will have to be equal to that of the acting prime minister, and all the staff would have to be equal. For many Israelis, this is a very important and controversial point. Another very important thing about the agreement when it comes to the prime minister is Netanyahu can't fire ministers that were appointed by Gantz and vice versa. So if Netanyahu, during his tenure as prime minister, is unhappy with one of the ministers in the blue and white bloc, he has to talk about it to Gantz, and they have to agree together to fire the minister. Same if Gantz is not happy with a minister under Netanyahu. Another important thing is that if Netanyahu for some reason resigns before the end of his tenure, currently 18 months, he can complete it later, which means in the current context that if, for example, he has to go to trial and he decides voluntarily to resign and defend himself in court, he can go back after in the best case for him, he's found innocent, he can come back to the office of prime minister and complete to the full 18 months after. This is a very controversial issue, the ministers. I'm not going to read all of this. You can read on your own, but these are the ministerial portfolios that are being divided between the Likud bloc and the blue and white bloc. Initially, they're going to have 32 ministers, and then after the emergency period, which will end in 6 months after Corona, the amount of ministers can increase to 36. This is significantly larger than most Israeli governments so far. There is a few people claiming that there was one other government larger than this, but this is very controversial. In addition to the 32 to the 36 ministers, there are also going to be 8 deputy ministers. This does not only mean that there are more people called a minister, it means that there's another ministerial office that needs to get budget, it needs to have staff, it needs to hire employees, it needs to get funding for certain programs. So having so many ministries can really affect how the Israeli budget looks like. I am only going to go through like the important ministries, what is called the bigger portfolios. So Likud bloc is going to get the treasury, the foreign affairs only for the second half, because the first half it's going to be held by blue and white, homeland security, education, interior, etc. The blue and white is going to get defense, the foreign ministry for the first half, justice, and economy is not as important as treasury. Other things that were agreed upon in the agreement is the Norwegian law. I don't know if you heard that phrase before, the Norwegian law or the hopping Norwegian law. This law means, so as of right now, the ministers do not have to be members of Knesset, although they 99.9% of the time there are members of Knesset. But according to the law, they don't have to be. So that means that a member of Knesset can be appointed minister, then he resigns from the Knesset, remains a minister, and then the next person on the list of the party can become a member of Knesset, because he wasn't before, because they had, let's say, 20 seats in the Knesset. Okay, now one of them remains a minister, but is no longer a member of Knesset, so number 21 on the list becomes the 20th member of Knesset from that party. The hopping Norwegian law, this is freestyle translation on my part, I'm sorry if it's not a very accurate one. This is something that was tailored for blue and white. As I said earlier, blue and white ran in the elections with a party called Yesh Atid. So if they actually implement the Norwegian law, it means that if a minister from Blue and White resigns from the Knesset, it is possible, very possible, that the next person on the list is a person from Yesh Atid, and not what remained Blue and White under Benny Gantz. This breaks the balance between coalition and opposition, because Yesh Atid will remain in the opposition, so they will grant the opposition more Knesset members, and also I assume there's also a personal issue there, because the breakup did not go smoothly. So ambassador to the United States would change halfway, which means Bibi will have his ambassador to the US until he's no longer prime minister, and then Gantz could appoint his own ambassador to the US. Ambassadors to the UN, London, Paris, and Canberra, appointed for the entire time. So Netanyahu can appoint them, but they will remain throughout the government's tenure, including when Gantz is prime minister. Now, the thing that I know you are all thinking about, the Trump deal of the century, the peace plan, the Trump plan and annexation could be discussed starting July 1st, which is the date the prime minister, who would be Netanyahu, on July 1st, if the government is actually sworn in, he can bring that to the government to vote. And the last point is that they're working in coordination in all respects. There were many criticisms of this agreement. What you see, I just have to refer to it, to the picture. It's quite an amazing picture if you look into it. It's a socially distant protest against the agreement and against Netanyahu forming a government. It took place in the central square in Tel Aviv, and it's pretty incredible. They're all wearing masks, keeping social distancing. Well, some people say they weren't, but whatever. It's pretty. It's a pretty amazing picture. But the main criticisms of the agreement is that there are too many ministers. The Norwegian law obviously is a big controversial point. Netanyahu as prime minister is something that got a lot of attention since, as you might be aware, Netanyahu is facing trial on charges of 3 cases of corruption, 1 case of corruption and 2 other more minor offenses, but he's facing trial. And a lot of people also criticize the fact that it's changing the basic system of government in Israel. So 2 prime ministers would be sworn in together to assure that Netanyahu steps out of the prime minister's office in time. So Gantz and Netanyahu would be sworn in at the same time. This is something that has never happened in Israel. So some people are saying that this coalition agreement is changing the basic system of government in Israel. This is why many people, NGOs, appeal to the Supreme Court of Israel to rule what's going to happen. The appeals and pressure and I assume other factors made the Likud and Blue and White put some changes, really last-minute changes. They shortened the limit on legislation and senior positions appointments to less than 6 months. So if a position has to be someone has to be appointed according to the law, it is going to be appointed immediately. The legislation that is not related to coronavirus is going to happen faster than they initially agreed on, only after the emergency period. The Norwegian law was removed from the agreement. It doesn't mean that it's not going to happen. It means that they're leaving it for a later day to decide. It might happen, might not, but they are not referring to it anymore in the coalition agreement. Basic principles of government, they decided that only after the government is formed initially, only after the government is formed, there is going to be a committee deciding the basic principles by which the government is operating. And now they decided that these basic principles are going to be drafted before the government is sworn in. And one very, very important and controversial point is the opposition representatives in the committee to appoint judges. So in Israel, the way judges in the Supreme Court are appointed is very different than the US. In Israel, there is a committee consisting of 2 ministers, 2 politicians who are not ministers, judges, and other people who vote and advocate for certain Supreme Court justices. Usually it was customary that there's an opposition representative as one of the 2 politicians who are not ministers. So right now they agreed that 1 minister is going to be from the Likud bloc and 1 minister from the blue and white bloc. And then the court criticized the fact that there's no opposition representative, because usually there is, and they decided to have the 2 politicians be 1 from the Likud bloc and 1 from the blue and white. So now they hinted they are going to give an opposition seat in the committee. And then it came to the court. As I said, few organizations appealed to the Supreme Court, arguing 2 things. First of all, that the coalition agreement fundamentally changes the Israeli system of government, and therefore the Supreme Court needs to intervene in it. And second of all, that a person who is being charged in court cannot assemble a government. The Israeli law to date says that a prime minister can serve until he or she is convicted. But they argue that it doesn't apply for people who are not in the position now, that it can't apply for people who are getting the mandate to form a coalition. The court decided not to intervene, but only for now. They hinted that the reason they're not intervening is because these rules allowing, all these things, all these regulations agreed upon in the agreement have not been legislated yet, and the court cannot intervene in things that were not legislated. So they kind of gave an opening for the people who appealed to appeal again once these things are legislated, and then the court might intervene. It's important to note that the court said that although they are not intervening right now, some of the clauses of the agreement bring significant difficulties. So they kind of hinted that they are not happy with some of the clauses. So now what's going to happen? This is obviously not a picture from now. The picture from today is like their elbow bumping, but I'm sure you can find it on your own. The rotation law between the prime ministers has passed in the Knesset. Bibi today got the mandate from President Ruvi Rivlin to assemble the government. And then there's open questions left. Will Yamina join the government? Yamina was traditionally, it's a right-wing party led by Naftali Bennett, Ayelet Shaked, Bezalel Smotrich, and Rafi Peretz. The first 2 you probably heard of. They are traditional allies of the Likud. But as of right now, they're demanding ministerial positions that the Likud claims it is not able to grant them. So a very big question is, will Yamina or parts of it will join the coalition, or will they stay in the opposition? They have never served in the opposition, so it's a big question. And who would get appointed as a minister? I know I said there's a lot of ministries, but don't forget they're working by blocks, so they have to give some of these ministries out. That leaves not a lot of ministers inside the Likud, so that's also a big thing. Now I'm going to open it up for question and answers. If you have other questions and answers, my Facebook, my Twitter, my Instagram, and my email are all here. And now feel free to ask away, either by unmuting yourselves or by writing in the chat. Okay. The Supreme Court justice clarified that Bibi would have to limit his involvement in decisions regarding certain present and future appointments. For example, he would not be able to decide on the appointments new state prosecutor, chief of police, and in less than 2 years, a new attorney general. The current coalition deal gives both Likud and Kahol Lavan veto power and appointments to these positions. If Netanyahu would be blocked from participating in the decisions, does this mean Kahol Lavan would get somewhat of an upper hand in designating these key positions? That's a very good question. For those of you who do not understand the context, the reason that the court said that Netanyahu would have to limit his involvement in appointing these positions is because he is facing criminal court cases, and all these positions are people who would potentially have an influence over his procedures. I do not believe Kahol Lavan would get an upper hand. The coalition agreement specifically says that the two blocs would have equal powers over everything. So I think they will find a way around it. I don't know what it will be, but it was very important for the two blocs to have parity in terms of power and authority. So I think they will find a solution for that. Okay, Mark. Thanks for the explanation. The media seems to be sort of as military action decisions are necessary, will Prime Minister Netanyahu be restricted? So I do not believe that Prime Minister Netanyahu is restricted in military action. As evidence, you can see some people are claiming that Israeli airstrikes in Syria have increased since this debacle / corona situation started. Obviously, all due to all according to foreign sources. We don't know if it's actually Israel or not, but Israel is claimed to have to attack in Syria multiple times in the last few weeks. So I don't think he will be restricted. I also think that in the Israeli context, there is a very deep understanding that military action is something that is above all else. So I really don't think so. The next question. So blue and white not liking Netanyahu. Really, what political differences are there between Likud and blue and white in terms of social issues and positioning international issues? That's a very important question. So as the person who asked this question kind of implied, and I also implied in the beginning of this presentation, the blue and white campaign surrounded Netanyahu and now is incapable to be prime minister and how he's corrupt. This kind of changed now that they are working together. The political differences, many people said there is not many political differences. I disagree. There are some people in blue and white who are more left-wing that typical Likud people would be. I would say that mostly in terms of social issues, like gay rights, like economic issues. On international issues, I think that's the best example because although Benny Gantz traveled to Washington, D.C. to meet with President Trump after he released the deal of the century, the peace plan, and said he is committed to advancing it. Later, he made some reservations and clarified and some clarifications that made people think that he's not 100% on board with annexation. So I think that's also an issue that they don't necessarily see eye to eye on. Yeah. And it is important to note that the two people in blue and white who are, let's say, more similar in views to Likud, Hauser and Handel, broke away from blue and white. They are now what I explained earlier to be called Derech Eretz. They will be joining that coalition, but they were the faction inside blue and white that is more similar in views to traditional Likud voters. How often are Knesset elections? So Knesset elections are supposed to be once every 4 years, but since the system in Israel is very different and a Knesset can, first of all, dissolve itself, like happened recently, and also members of Knesset can vote a vote of no confidence in Knesset. In practical terms, no Knesset actually lasted like 4 years, so most of them range around 3 years. Any more questions? You can unmute yourself or write. Sophia, if there's any questions in the Facebook, also please let me know. I don't have any.
Question.
Oh, sorry.
Once upon a time, there was an Emmet party, and you had it in Hebrew there on the screen. But what happened to that?
What party?
Emmet, olive
Emet.
name top.
So Emet is labor. Emet is the so each party has letters that it has on the little note that you put in the ballot box. Emet are the letters that belong to the Labor Party. Okay, I have another question in the chat. Given the highly unusual aspects in the coalition agreement, you already stated, is there any possibility of another Supreme Court intervention in Israeli politics in your future? Yes, I do think that. I think the Supreme Court in this case, I know many in Israel disagree with me, but I really think that the justices in the now talking about the appeals against Netanyahu forming a government and against the coalition agreement made it very clear that there are certain things in the coalition agreement they're not happy with. And I think that if people appeal again once the Knesset passes laws enabling these clauses in the coalition agreement, obviously laws have to be passed because it is pretty diverging from everything that the Israeli political system has seen so far. So I think they will intervene, but it's still important to mention that the changes that Blue and White and Likud made to the coalition agreement before the Supreme Court ruling might make it difficult for the Supreme Court to intervene. On the case of if whether or not Netanyahu can form a government, I think that's set, and they said they have no reason to intervene, and I don't think they will intervene in that. They might intervene in other clauses of the coalition agreement.
Ophir, I have a two-part question.
Yes.
The tensions in Israeli society between secular and religious groups, how is that going to work within the unity government? That's part one. And part two, although Lieberman lost a lot of leverage, one of his plans is to get more religious people to join the army, to incorporate them in the army in some form of service. Is anything going to be done about that?
So I will first address the second one because it's easier. Benny Gantz, who was, as I said, chief of staff before, also expressed his opinions many times, and he is also very much interested in incorporating more ultra-Orthodox people in the army. So I think it is something that is going to happen. It is going to be difficult because two ultra-Orthodox parties, Shas and UTJ, are part of this coalition. And in the past, it has shown that it's impossible to legislate things like that when they are there. I promise I wouldn't, but I have to. I will give my personal opinion on this issue. I think that forcing ultra-Orthodox people to draft into the army has proved to fail. And I think we need to be innovative. And I think that volunteering in a hospital is no less productive than being a secretary for a commander. No disrespect whatsoever, but I think that in some cases we can compromise and let them do national service, even inside their own communities, who are in many cases really, really needed, instead of doing military service. And there are many people today who are doing national service and it works great. There's no reason to not expand this program, especially when there are many testimonies within the IDF saying that the IDF doesn't really need all these people, especially not ultra-Orthodox people who are in many cases, their education system is very different and they find it very hard to integrate into the army. And also very hard for them because it's a whole new way of life. And for the first question, I think this is a very interesting question. The last cycle of elections saw a lot of what people called incitements or a lot of feuds between different communities in Israel. Lieberman against the ultra-Orthodox against Lieberman, etc. And in this government, surprisingly, you get this weird combo of ultra-Orthodox sitting with labor. This is something that happened in the past, but in the very distant past in Israel. And they will have to make it work. I mean, the fact that now Netanyahu and Gantz are speaking about extending it to 4 years and not 3 might prove even that they might even think that it's possible. I do not think it's going to be easy. For example, in Blue and White, there are a lot of people who support more liberal views on abortions, LGBTQ plus rights, and stuff like that. And the ultra-Orthodox, for them, all these things are, unthinkable. It is going to be different, but I think a national unity government might be, even if it's very forced and very weird right now, and, just because we don't have any other choice and we really need a government, that might be something that could be helpful in bringing back together some communities. Any other questions? Okay, Ophir, is there an Israeli news feed that does not filter its I think there's a lot of Israeli media outlets that you should follow. My rule of thumb is never to follow one media outlet. Every media outlet has some sort of bias. Usually, don't take an example from me. I have 20 different media outlets on my phone and they're all beeping at the same time. That's not healthy, like one of the people on this chat often tells me. But I would highly recommend viewing multiple. I every morning read both Yediot Achronot and Israel Hayom, which are the 2 largest newspapers in Israel. And most of the time you find there the same thing in very different words. I would highly recommend reading both of them. And in terms of website, if you want to get more the left-leaning perspective, I would recommend Haaretz. And if you want more center, maybe Ynet. And if you want more right-wing, I would highly recommend Israel Hayom, Makor Rishon, who are really great. If you're interested in English material, the Jerusalem Post and the Times of Israel are really great resources. And we even have an SSI blog in one of them, so feel free to check it out. And if you direct message me later, I will be happy to send you links to everything, including my own weekly op-ed in Israel Hayom, so feel free to reach out. Anyone else? Okay, so I'm gonna ask Sophia now to stop recording. So if there's anyone